She had always been known as the woman who carried her home on her shoulders, who gave more than she ever received, and who stood by her husband through every season of want and plenty. Her mornings began before the sun rose, her feet moving silently across the earth as she prepared food, fetched water, and tended to the animals. By the time her husband stirred from sleep, the day had already been shaped by her hands. She worked tirelessly, never uttering a complaint, because love had taught her that sacrifice was the truest language of devotion. Her heart belonged to him fully, and she believed that in her loyalty he would always see her worth. When he struggled to provide, she tightened her own belt so he would not feel shame. When he returned home weary from the fields or his dealings in the village, she greeted him with a soft smile, her presence steady as the roots of a great tree. Many whispered of her strength, saying she was the kind of wife men prayed for. But behind her eyes lay a quiet ache, a pain she carried alone because love, while tender, often demanded more than it should. Her devotion was not without wounds. Nights would sometimes pass where he left her in silence, choosing to share his thoughts with others rather than with her. She would listen to his laughter drift from outside while she sat in the hut, staring at the flames of her cooking fire, trying to convince herself that his happiness, even if not shared with her, was enough. And though he gave her children's laughter, though he gave her moments of joy, she could not help but feel the cracks forming inside her spirit. Yet still she endured. She taught herself to smile through loneliness, to fold her sorrows into the fabric of her duties so no one would know how heavy they weighed on her. She wove baskets with care, humming songs her mother once sang, and she found comfort in watching her children grow strong under her guidance. Her sacrifices became invisible threads that held her family together, though she often wondered if anyone else could see them. In the quiet of the night, when the village was hushed and even the wind seemed to rest, she would sometimes whisper to herself, questioning why love had to come with so much silence, why loyalty was met with indifference. But even then she convinced her heart to stay steady, telling herself that perhaps this was what it meant to be a wife, to carry the weight of both joy and sorrow, and to give endlessly without demanding return. Her devotion was unshaken, but within her soul lived a fragile hope that one day he would truly see her, not just as the woman who cooked, who bore his children, and who worked herself weary, but as the woman whose love was a constant fire, quiet but enduring, waiting to be acknowledged before it was extinguished by neglect. Under the fading glow of the village evening fires, the news spread like a restless wind. The husband had chosen another wife. To the people, it was not unusual for a man of means to take another woman into his household, but the manner in which he did so carved deep wounds into the heart of his first wife. She had given him her youth, her strength, and her loyalty, believing that her sacrifices and devotion were the soil upon which their marriage would always grow. Yet, instead of honoring her, he allowed his desire to eclipse her dignity. He did not come to her quietly, nor speak to her with gentleness about his decision. Instead, he announced it in front of the elders and neighbors, as though the years she had poured into his home and his life were of little consequence. The sting of betrayal began not only with his words but with the way his eyes no longer carried her reflection. Where once he had looked at her with gratitude, now there was distance, as if she were no more than a shadow in the corner of his hut. When he spoke of his new bride, his tone was bright and proud, and the village clapped their hands in approval. But when he looked upon the woman who had borne his hardships, who had carried his meals, tended his wounds, and sat by his side in sickness, there was silence. She was humiliated not by strangers but by the man whose hands had once held hers in tenderness. The first wife stood quietly as the crowd whispered and watched. Some pitied her, their eyes lowered, while others mocked her silently, wondering aloud what she had failed to give him. The shame was not only in his decision but in how he paraded it, stripping her of honor in the marketplace of public opinion. She recalled the long nights she had stayed awake, waiting for him, the mornings she had risen before dawn to fetch water and prepare food. Every stitch in his clothing, every grain pounded for his meals, every small act of love she had woven into the fabric of their marriage seemed suddenly torn apart. Her heart trembled under the weight of betrayal, but her lips remained sealed. She remembered her mother's words, "A woman's silence can sometimes carry more strength than her cries." Yet silence that day felt like a cage, a suffocating enclosure where her dignity was being crushed. Her pain was visible in the way her body stiffened, her hands tightening around the cloth she held as though it could anchor her from falling apart. At night, when she was alone, the betrayal seeped deeper. She asked herself whether her sacrifices had ever been truly seen or whether she had been invisible all along, her devotion nothing more than an expectation fulfilled. Her memories of their laughter and shared dreams twisted into sharp thorns that pricked her heart. She recalled how he once promised her that she would be his only one, his forever. Now those promises seemed like ashes blown away by the wind. What pierced her the most was not only his betrayal but the lack of reverence for her place in his life. To take another wife was one thing, but to erase her worth in the eyes of the community was another. He could have chosen a path of respect, but instead he chose humiliation, leaving her spirit bruised. The whispers of the village became heavy chains, reminding her daily of her wounded pride. Still, beneath the pain there stirred a quiet fire. For though he had shamed her, she was not broken. Betrayal can bend the heart, but it can also awaken a strength long hidden. As she watched preparations for the new wife's arrival, she carried her sorrow like a heavy pot upon her head, silent but undeniable. She was the first wife, the one who had laid the foundation of his household, and though he sought to diminish her, the earth itself seemed to remember her devotion. In her solitude, she began to understand that betrayal had given her something she had not asked for but now carried. A voice inside her, echoing against her silence, whispering that her pain would not go unanswered. The husband's betrayal was not the end of her story, it was the wound that would awaken something far more powerful than his careless pride. Though her heart wept, her spirit quietly prepared for what lay ahead. When the drums of celebration echoed through the village for the coming of the second wife, the first wife sat quietly in the corner of her hut, her head bowed low. Her grief did not roar in the open, it did not throw stones or scream curses into the night. Instead, it moved like water beneath the earth, silent and steady, carving deep paths through her soul. Each tear that fell upon her mat seemed to vanish into the soil, yet the earth itself carried her sorrow as though it were storing it for a time yet to come. By day she hid her pain behind lowered eyes and quiet movements. She continued her tasks as though nothing had changed, cooking, fetching water, tending to the fire. To those who glanced her way she looked like a woman subdued, perhaps even broken. But those who looked longer could see the shadows beneath her gaze, the way her lips trembled when she whispered prayers under her breath. Her silence became her companion, but it was not empty. It was heavy, full of words unspoken, of wounds that would not close. At night, when the village was wrapped in stillness, she let her grief flow freely. The walls of her hut absorbed the sound of her muffled cries. She prayed into the darkness, calling upon the spirits of her ancestors, upon the mothers who had walked before her, upon the unseen powers that dwelled in the winds and waters. "See me," she whispered. "Do not let my suffering be wasted. Do not let my loyalty be mocked." Her words were carried into the night like threads of smoke, weaving themselves into the air that touched every corner of the village. Her grief was not the kind that fades with time. It grew deeper with each passing day, each glance at her husband's proud face, each sound of laughter that came from the preparations for his new wife. Yet, the silence she chose became her shield. She did not fight in the market square with words. She did not curse him openly. She carried her sorrow with a dignity that even humiliation could not strip away. In the stillness of her heart, her pain ripened, becoming more than grief, it became power. The villagers whispered about her, though not always in cruelty. Some pitied her, saying her silence was weakness. Others wondered if she was planning something they could not see. But a few, the elders especially, recognized the weight of a woman's silent suffering. They knew that silence has its own way of speaking, that prayers whispered through tears can stir mountains and summon storms. Her body felt weary from the heaviness she carried, but her spirit reached into unseen places. Each tear was like an offering, each sob a plea etched into the wind. She began to notice small signs around her, how the wind would suddenly stir when she prayed, how the fire in her hearth would flare as if answering her grief. At first, she dismissed them as coincidence, but slowly she came to understand that her pain was not ignored. Her suffering was being heard. There were nights when she felt the presence of something greater pressing into her hut. The air grew thick, and her skin prickled as though unseen hands brushed against her. It was not frightening but heavy, like the weight of a promise. She knew then that her prayers had reached beyond the walls, into the realm where spirits listened. Her grief, carried in silence, was not her own anymore. It had become part of something vast, something that stirred beneath the surface of her life. She continued to serve her husband, though her heart was shattered. She greeted others with gentleness, though her spirit bled. Her silence was not the silence of defeat but the silence of seeds buried in the ground, waiting for the right season to break open. She was no longer only a woman humiliated, she was becoming the vessel of something larger. Her suffering, unseen by many, was weaving a destiny that none could yet imagine. The husband, blind in his pride, mistook her quiet for acceptance. He believed she had surrendered, that her tears had dried into obedience. But the winds that moved at night knew better. The earth beneath her hut knew better. And the unseen powers that hovered at the edge of her prayers knew that her silent grief carried a strength greater than the laughter of any feast. In the silence of her suffering, the first wife became more than she had been before. She was sorrow wrapped in patience, pain clothed in dignity, and prayer turned into power. Though the world mocked her place, the unseen world listened closely, preparing to answer her in a way no one would expect. The drums of celebration rolled across the village like thunder, their rhythm carrying joy and anticipation. Women gathered in circles, weaving garlands of bright flowers and pounding grain for the feast, while men sharpened knives for the slaughter of goats. Children danced about, their laughter rising high, chasing each other between huts as the air filled with the fragrance of roasted meat and palm wine. Everywhere one looked, there was a sense of festivity, of life bursting forth in colors and songs. The second bride was spoken of as if she were a queen, her beauty praised even before she stepped foot into her new home. The husband walked tall through the preparations, his chest swollen with pride, his eyes glittering with the arrogance of one who believed himself favored by fortune. He moved from group to group, overseeing, smiling, and boasting, as if the entire village had gathered to celebrate not just a marriage but his own greatness. The villagers, though whispering among themselves, still obeyed the call to celebrate. They beat their drums louder, they sang with more vigor, and they carried baskets of food and jars of drink, trying to bury the uneasy silence that sometimes crept into their midst. For even amid the joy there was something else, something unspoken, a strange heaviness in the air. When the wind swept across the village, it carried with it a chill that made women glance at each other with uneasy eyes. The smoke from the cooking fires did not rise straight into the sky. Instead, it swirled and twisted as if reluctant to leave the ground. The goats tethered near the feasting grounds bleated restlessly, stamping their hooves and refusing to stay still. Even the drumming, for all its liveliness, seemed to echo strangely, as though the earth beneath was responding in a tongue no one understood. The first wife watched quietly, her face calm though her heart was bruised. She had dressed herself simply, refusing the bright cloths and ornaments the women offered her. Instead, she sat near the edge of the preparations, weaving mats with steady hands, her eyes lowered but her mind alert. Each beat of the drum seemed to strike against her ribs, reminding her of the betrayal she endured. Yet she said nothing. Her silence was a weight upon the air, and though no one dared to mention it, all could feel it. The villagers tried to distract themselves with the merriment. Women praised the gifts being prepared for the new bride: clay pots filled with oil, woven baskets of grain, strings of beads polished until they shone in the sunlight. The young men rehearsed the songs they would sing when the bride was escorted into her husband's home, their voices strong and eager. The children carried flowers, plucking fresh blossoms from the fields, their little hands stained green from broken stems. Outwardly it was a day of joy. But beneath it all, there was a sense that the village itself was holding its breath. Whispers spread from mouth to ear as elders exchanged glances. Some said the spirits of the ancestors were restless, their blessings not fully given. Others murmured that the first wife's silence was too deep, too heavy, as if she had given her grief to the winds themselves. Still others spoke of the animal's strange behavior, recalling that in times past such signs had foretold calamity. Yet no one dared to stop the celebrations. Pride and tradition demanded the feast continue, no matter what unease stirred at its edges. The groom ignored these murmurs, brushing aside the concerns as foolish superstition. He ordered the drummers to play louder, the dancers to move faster, and the women to add more food to the fires. He wanted the celebration to drown out any trace of fear, to prove to all that this day belonged to him and his new bride. And so the music rose, the people danced, and laughter was forced into the air. But even as the sound swelled, the unease deepened. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the village. The garlands of flowers swayed violently, scattering petals across the ground. The fire in the largest hearth roared high, sending sparks into the air, before shrinking back to a trembling flame. For a moment the drums faltered, their rhythm broken. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the people's chests. The goats bleated again, louder this time, pulling at their ropes as if trying to flee. Then, as quickly as it had come, the wind died away. The drummers resumed their rhythm, the dancers picked up their steps, and the villagers forced laughter into their throats. But the unease remained, crawling like a shadow at the edges of their joy. They could not shake the feeling that something unseen had passed among them, something that watched and waited. The first wife, still seated with her mat in her lap, lifted her eyes briefly to the sky. The air smelled of rain though no clouds yet gathered. She felt the heaviness pressing into her chest, and she knew it was not just her sorrow, it was something greater, something that had listened to her prayers in the silence of her suffering. As the preparations continued around her, she whispered softly into the wind, words only the unseen powers could hear. The villagers sang, danced, and feasted into the night, but beneath their celebration was a heartbeat of dread, a knowledge they dared not speak aloud. The wedding would proceed, yes, but the air carried a warning. Joy built on betrayal does not stand long before it crumbles. The day of the ceremony dawned bright, with sunlight spilling over the village like molten gold. Women rose early, their laughter weaving into the morning air as they prepared the feast. Pots simmered with spiced stews, and roasted meat crackled over the fire, sending up rich, enticing aromas that drifted into every corner of the village. The drummers began their rhythm long before the guests gathered, their hands striking the skins with practiced ease, building a pulse that echoed the heartbeat of celebration. Voices rose in song, high and sweet, praising the groom and welcoming the new bride who would soon cross the threshold of her new home. The air was thick with music, feasting, and laughter, but beneath the surface shadows stirred and lingered, waiting to make themselves known. The first wife sat apart, her presence a silent wound among the festivities. She had once been the center of her husband's pride, the one who had cooked the first meals in his home, woven mats for his floor, and borne the weight of his dreams. Yet on this day she was invisible. The women who had once sought her counsel averted their eyes. The children who had once nestled in her lap avoided her gaze, running instead to lay flowers at the feet of the new bride. It was as if her years of devotion had been erased in a single stroke, replaced by the shimmer of the younger woman who now held the villagers' attention. The bride herself was radiant, her garments adorned with bright beads and woven cloth that caught the sunlight. Her hair was braided with cowries, each shell clinking softly as she moved. Her skin gleamed with palm oil, and her face bore the confidence of one stepping into triumph. She smiled as she was led through the village, the women ululating with joy, their voices piercing the air in waves of celebration. The groom walked beside her, his posture proud, his chest thrust forward, basking in the admiration of his people. To him, this was a day of honor, proof of his strength and wealth, proof that he could take what he desired without consequence. But not all eyes sparkled with joy. The elders, seated beneath the shade of an old baobab, exchanged uneasy glances. Their lips sang the songs, but their hearts beat with caution. They had seen many weddings in their time, and though the sounds of celebration rang loudly in their ears, they could not ignore the silence that pulsed beneath it, the silence of the first wife who sat apart, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her lips sealed in sorrow. It was not anger they feared from her but something deeper, something they could not name. As the bride and groom were seated before the gathered crowd, the drummers quickened their pace. Women carried in dishes of steaming food, men poured calabashes of palm wine, and laughter spilled freely from every throat. Songs rose high into the air, songs of love, of unity, of the blessings of the ancestors upon this union. Children danced barefoot in the dust, their movements wild and joyful. The bride's relatives clapped and sang, declaring her fortune, while the groom's kin boasted of their son's power. Every sound, every gesture was one of joy. And yet, to those who listened closely, there was something hollow about it, as though the celebration were a mask stretched too thin over something waiting to break through. The first wife's place was not among the celebrants but at the very edge of the gathering. She was given no honor, no role in the ceremony. When she attempted to join the women in song, their voices rose louder to drown her out. When she lifted her eyes to the bride, the younger woman turned her head, smiling instead at the crowd. Even her husband, whose life she had tended with quiet devotion, did not once glance her way. She was a shadow in her own home, a ghost seated among the living. The music grew louder, the dancing wilder, the feasting richer. But strange things began to disturb the flow of the celebration. The flames of the cooking fires flared too high, crackling as if whipped by unseen hands. A pot of stew boiled over suddenly, its contents spilling into the fire with a hiss that silenced the women gathered around it. The drummers faltered for a heartbeat, their rhythm stumbling before they regained their pace. The goats tethered nearby bleated and struggled, pulling against their ropes with frantic energy. The air grew thick, heavy, as though it carried more than just smoke and laughter. The people noticed but refused to speak of it. They poured more wine, clapped their hands harder, and lifted their voices higher, trying to drown the unease that gnawed at the edges of their celebration. Yet every now and then someone's eyes flicked toward the first wife, sitting in silence, her hands unmoving, her gaze lowered. Her stillness was a contrast to the chaos around her, and it unsettled them more than they would admit. The bride, basking in her triumph, seemed oblivious to these signs. She danced gracefully, her cowries clinking with each step, her laughter clear as water. She relished the songs sung in her name, the gifts laid before her, the glances of envy cast in her direction. The groom smiled beside her, lifting her hand high for all to see, declaring her his in a voice that carried over the music. But even as he spoke, a wind swept suddenly through the crowd, scattering flower petals and extinguishing one of the smaller fires. A murmur rippled through the villagers, quickly smothered by more laughter and clapping. Still the shadows lingered. They clung to the edges of the celebration, curling in the corners of the huts, whispering in the spaces between drumbeats. Though the songs rose loud and the feast was abundant, the air seemed to thrum with warning. The first wife sat motionless, her silence deep as the river, and though no one dared to speak it aloud, many felt that silence pressing upon them more heavily than any drumbeat or song. The ceremony continued, but unease had woven itself into the heart of the celebration. Joy and dread danced side by side, and though laughter rang out, it could not hide the truth that shadows had come to witness the union. And in those shadows, the power of the first wife's unspoken grief waited, patient and unyielding. The moment the new bride was led to her seat, the air was thick with music and celebration. The drums thundered, women ululated, and men raised their calabashes of wine in praise of the union. She was radiant, her garments shimmering in the fading light, her smile wide as though she had stepped into glory itself. The groom, proud and boastful, guided her to the mat laid with woven cloth, where she would sit as the honored wife. All eyes were upon her, waiting for her first words, the words that would seal the moment in memory. But as she lowered herself onto the mat, a hush fell, sudden and unnatural. It was as if the air itself held its breath. The bride opened her mouth, ready to speak her husband's name with triumph, ready to declare her joy before the crowd. Instead, a sharp cry tore from her throat, raw and piercing, and the name she uttered was not his. It was the name of the first wife. The sound cut through the laughter like a blade. The drummer's hands froze mid-strike. The ululations of the women died in their throats. The bride's face twisted with confusion and terror, as if the word had been wrenched from her unwillingly, pulled from the depths of her being by a force beyond her control. She clutched her chest, gasping, and repeated the name again, louder this time, echoing into every ear, filling the space with dread. The villagers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the first wife, who still sat in silence, her face unreadable. Some gasped, some covered their mouths, while others whispered frantically among themselves. The groom, his pride curdling into rage, leaned toward his new bride, gripping her arm harshly, demanding she speak his name. But when she opened her mouth again, it was the same cry, the first wife's name, stretched and trembling, as though the sound belonged to no living woman but to something older, deeper, and sorrowful. Fear spread like fire. Elders muttered that it was a bad omen, that no bride should ever cry another's name on her wedding day, least of all the name of the wife who had been scorned. Children clung to their mothers, unsettled by the unnatural sound. The women who had mocked the first wife earlier now avoided her eyes, their laughter forgotten, their voices strangled in their throats. The bride, trembling, tried to cover her mouth with her hands, but still the name slipped out, whispering through her lips like a chant, like a curse that would not be silenced. Each time it came, her body shook, her eyes darting wildly as if she too feared the sound that betrayed her. Her beauty, once so radiant, now seemed haunted, her laughter turned into sobs that she could not control. The groom stood, furious, his pride crumbling before the crowd. He shouted at the bride to stop, to speak his name instead, but the more he demanded, the more her cries grew, until the night air itself seemed to echo with that one forbidden name. It was not the sound of triumph or love but the wail of something unresolved, a grief given voice through her unwilling lips. And through it all, the first wife remained silent. She did not move, she did not smile, she did not weep. Yet her stillness filled the space, heavier than the drums, heavier than the whispers, heavier than the cries of the new bride. It was as though the bride's voice had been taken from her and given to something greater, a spirit that demanded to be heard, that refused to be forgotten. When the cries finally fell into silence, no one celebrated. The feast lay untouched, the drums unplayed, the laughter gone. The bride, exhausted and pale, collapsed onto the mat, trembling. And the villagers knew in their hearts that the night had turned. What was meant to be a union of joy had been marked instead by dread, and the name of the first wife, once ignored, had now become a cry that none could erase. The cry did not fade with the bride's collapse. It clung to the ears and hearts of the people, echoing long after her lips fell silent. The villagers looked at one another with wide, fearful eyes, their whispers sharp as the hiss of dry grass in the wind. Mothers clutched their children close, while elders shook their heads in grim recognition, muttering that no wedding ever blessed by the ancestors had begun in such a way. The air itself seemed restless, as though the ground beneath them remembered an old injustice that no celebration could bury. Fear slithered among the gathered crowd. Some whispered that it was not truly the bride who spoke, but a spirit that had forced her mouth open, a spirit that had chosen the name of the first wife as a warning. Others murmured of curses, of ancestral wrath stirred by betrayal, of the deep shame of humiliating a faithful woman before the eyes of the village. The more they spoke, the heavier the dread became, pressing against every chest like a weight none could lift. The drummers tried to raise their hands again, to chase away the unease with the sound of their sticks, but not one could bring himself to strike. Their drums felt heavy, lifeless, and each time they tried, the memory of the bride's strange cry filled their minds until their hands shook. The dancers who had prepared to leap in celebration instead stood frozen, staring at the bride as though she were no longer of flesh but some vessel for the unseen. The groom, humiliated, shouted for silence, demanding that the people stop their murmurs. But his voice cracked beneath the weight of their fear, and instead of quieting, the whispers grew louder, spreading like fire in the grass. It is a sign. The ancestors are displeased. The first wife's spirit has risen. Some dared not speak at all, but their eyes carried the same terror, the same unspoken truth. No man could silence what had already been unleashed. The bride's family trembled, glancing about as though searching for a way to flee the shame. Children began to cry, their small voices mingling with the murmurs until the whole gathering felt like a place abandoned by joy. Even the goats tied at the edge of the compound bleated restlessly, pulling at their ropes, sensing the wrongness that humans tried to name but could not. And at the center of it all sat the first wife, silent as stone. Her stillness unsettled the crowd more than the cries themselves, for they began to believe she had called the spirits without uttering a word. To many, it no longer mattered whether she had spoken aloud or prayed in silence. Her presence carried power, and the night had revealed it. No one ate, no one sang, no one dared laugh. The feast became an empty display, the food untouched, the drink soured by unease. The air was thick with the sense that the world of the living had been crossed by something from beyond, and every whisper carried the same fearful thought. A wedding cursed on its first night could only bring ruin. By the time darkness deepened and the fires burned low, the people slipped away in uneasy silence, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid even to look directly at the first wife. The celebration that had begun with songs and dancing ended in dread, each villager carrying the story on their lips. The bride's first cry had not been of joy but of warning, and it had shaken the very heart of the village. The husband, who had once carried himself with the pride of a man admired and obeyed, now found himself crumbling under the weight of shame heavier than any burden he had ever known. The name of his first wife, called out from the lips of the new bride, had not been a passing mistake, nor the slip of a tongue still trembling with fear. It had been a wail that tore through the air like a curse, ringing in every corner of the village. Men who had clapped their hands in rhythm to the drums now let their arms fall useless to their sides. Women who had been preparing food and singing praises froze in silence, their eyes shifting uneasily toward the husband. The children, sensing the shift in the air, clutched their mothers and stared wide-eyed at the bride who trembled uncontrollably, her voice echoing again with the name that was not meant to be hers to cry. The husband rushed forward, his heart pounding with fury and dread, his hand tightening around the bride's shoulder as though he could silence her by force. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the heavy air. But the bride looked at him with eyes that were no longer hers alone. Her lips trembled, and again the sound came, louder this time, piercing deeper. The first wife's name, carried as though a spirit had planted it within her. The husband's face turned pale, sweat beading on his brow though the air was cool. Around him, the villagers began whispering, first quietly then louder, until the murmurs grew into a storm of voices. "This is not natural," some muttered. "The ancestors have spoken," others said. His first wife's soul is crying through the bride. The shame burned him alive. It was not just the cry of the bride that humiliated him, it was the eyes of his people, once filled with respect, now filled with suspicion and scorn. He felt their judgment pressing on him like 1,000 stones. His attempt to cast aside the woman who had given him her loyalty, her service, her very soul, was no longer hidden. It was laid bare in front of everyone, the gods themselves seeming to declare him guilty. He tried to laugh it off, forcing his lips to curl though his voice trembled. The girl is nervous. She does not know what she says. But the bride continued trembling, her cries now uncontrollable. Again and again the names slipped out of her like a chant, each repetition striking him like a spear. His people did not laugh. No one moved to help him. Even the drummers lowered their instruments, the rhythm silenced as though the spirits had commanded it. His first wife, standing in the shadows at the edge of the crowd, watched silently. She had not uttered a word, nor lifted a hand, yet her presence seemed to swell, her silence more powerful than his shouts. Some villagers began to look at her with fear, others with pity, and still others with awe. They whispered that perhaps her pain had been so deep that even the heavens could not ignore it. The husband, realizing their eyes were shifting toward her, felt his shame deepen into something unbearable. Desperate, he seized the bride's face and shook her as if to rattle the spirit out of her. "Say my name," he roared, the veins in his neck bulging. But the bride only whimpered and, through her sobs, cried out once more the first wife's name, louder than ever before. The villagers recoiled. Some clutched charms around their necks. Some spat into the dust to ward off spirits. Others simply stared at him, their faith in his strength unraveling with every cry. The husband's hands dropped, his shoulders sinking under the invisible weight pressing him down. His pride, the very thing that had driven him to take another wife despite already being blessed with devotion, now lay shattered. He tried to speak again but his voice failed him, his throat tightening until only broken sounds came out. The more he struggled to maintain control, the more the shame consumed him. No man could face his people like this. No leader, no husband, no father could stand with dignity when the earth itself seemed to side against him. The spirits had exposed him, stripping him of the power he thought untouchable. He glanced around, seeking even one face that would rise in his defense, but none came. His brothers turned their eyes away. His elders shook their heads in silence. Even the children seemed to know the truth, that he had betrayed love and been punished for it. He turned at last toward his first wife, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The shame in his eyes told its own story, one too late to rewrite. She stood still, her face unreadable, her silence echoing louder than the bride's cries. It was the silence of truth, of endurance, of a woman whose pain had risen beyond her to something greater, something eternal. The husband sank to his knees, not in humility but in defeat. He had tried to silence what could not be silenced. He had tried to bury devotion and replace it with pride. Now, before his people, before his wives, and before the spirits who bore witness, his shame became his crown, heavy and unmovable. And though the crowd remained hushed, their judgment was clear. A man who betrays loyalty will never escape the voice of truth, no matter how loudly he tries to shout it down. The first wife had long carried her sorrow in silence, a burden pressed against her chest like an invisible stone. She had been the woman who gave her all, who poured her love and labor into the home, who prayed for her husband in the still of night while he slept unknowing. 4 years she endured, believing that loyalty and sacrifice would shield her marriage from betrayal. But when he had taken another wife, casting her aside as though she were nothing, that silence had grown heavier, threatening to break her spirit. Yet now, in the midst of the storm of shame and whispers that shook the village, her sorrow no longer bowed her down. It began to rise, reshaping itself into a strength no one could ignore. She had not spoken a word during the ceremony. She had not shouted, cursed, or demanded justice. Instead, her silence became its own voice, echoing in the cries of the new bride. It was as if her pain had seeped into the very air, carried on the wind, resting upon the drums, whispering in the hearts of everyone present. The villagers turned their eyes toward her, some with fear, others with reverence, and slowly they began to understand. This was not just a woman wronged, this was a woman whose spirit had awakened something greater than any mortal hand could command. She stood at the edge of the gathering, her posture calm, her face shadowed but steady. The shame of her husband had made him tremble before the people, but her quiet presence made them tremble in another way. It was not the trembling of mockery or suspicion. It was the trembling one feels when standing in the presence of something sacred, something untouchable. Her grief, once hidden like a wound, had transformed into an unseen mantle of power draped across her shoulders. The villagers who once dismissed her as forgotten now found themselves unable to look away. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispering that the first wife's sorrow had been seen by the ancestors. Elders exchanged heavy glances, muttering that no spirit could ignore such loyalty betrayed. Even the youth, who only moments earlier had danced and laughed in celebration, now stared in awe at the woman who did nothing but stand. They began to realize that her presence could not be erased, not by another wife, not by a husband's betrayal, and not by the attempts to bury her beneath silence. She was as much a part of the village as the earth beneath their feet, her pain now woven into its story forever. The husband, humiliated and broken, avoided her gaze, but his cowardice only magnified her strength in the eyes of the people. He had tried to silence her by replacing her, but the spirits themselves had chosen to speak for her, using the lips of the new bride to carry her name. What greater power could a woman hold than to have her truth lifted beyond her own voice, sung by forces that even men could not defy? The first wife did not smile, nor did she cry. Her expression remained calm, her heart steady, as if she already knew the truth that the others were only now beginning to see. Pain had not destroyed her, it had carved her into something stronger. Her sorrow had become a fire that could not be extinguished, burning not in anger but in quiet defiance. In that moment she no longer seemed like a discarded woman, but like a figure chosen by destiny, one whose story would outlast the shame of her husband and the fear of his household. Some villagers whispered that she was no longer merely a wife, but a vessel of justice. Others said her silence was heavier than thunder, her sorrow sharper than any blade. Whatever the words, they all carried the same meaning. The first wife's presence had become eternal. Her name, spoken by the new bride, had sealed her in the memory of the people. She could not be erased, for she had been written into the very fabric of their lives by something greater than man. As the drums remained silent and the villagers held their breath, one truth settled over them like the setting sun. Devotion is never forgotten, loyalty cannot be discarded, and sorrow, when deep enough, can transform into a strength beyond measure. The first wife, once humiliated, now stood as a testament that love, even when wounded, can call upon powers unseen. And though she did not raise her voice, the people knew her presence would forever echo, carried in the winds, remembered in the whispers, and feared by any who dared to betray such devotion again. The husband had once believed himself untouchable. His wealth, his authority in the village, and his pride as a man had given him confidence that he could do as he pleased without consequence. When he decided to take another wife, he thought nothing of the woman who had stood by him through hardship. He convinced himself that her love was expendable, her sacrifices invisible, and her loyalty a weakness to be discarded. But when the new bride's first cry had pierced the air and carried not his name, but the name of the wife he had abandoned, something within him shattered. That moment marked the beginning of his undoing, for the ancestors and spirits do not ignore betrayal so grave, and they had already set their gaze upon him. The villagers no longer looked at him with admiration or respect. Where once they had seen a man of stature, they now saw only a fool cloaked in shame. His face burned beneath their stares, but what he feared most was not their whispers, it was the silence that followed, the heavy stillness that seemed to hum with unseen power. He knew the silence belonged to the spirits, that unseen realm of justice which weighed a man's deeds with unflinching truth. It was as though the air itself had turned against him, pressing down upon his shoulders, stripping away his pride piece by piece until he stood bare, trembling in his weakness. At night he could not sleep. The cries of the new bride haunted him, replaying in his ears until he began to hear the first wife's name carried by the wind outside his hut. The shadows lengthened strangely, moving as though they had life, and sometimes he swore he saw a figure, his first wife's figure, standing silently beyond the firelight. No matter how tightly he closed his eyes, no matter how loudly he tried to drown the sounds with song or laughter, the voice returned, soft but unrelenting, reminding him of his betrayal. The ancestors did not strike him all at once. His punishment was drawn out, slow and unyielding, so that he could taste the bitterness of every choice he had made. The wealth he thought would protect him began to dwindle. Crops failed in his fields, animals grew restless, and trade no longer favored his household. The new wife, once a symbol of his pride, began to weep daily, her spirit unsettled by the forces that lingered around their home. Each time she tried to sleep, she would cry out again in the first wife's name, as though the spirits had bound her tongue. It became a torment he could not escape, for each cry was both a reminder and a curse, echoing through the night until even the villagers grew afraid of his dwelling. His body weakened under the weight of guilt and fear. Food tasted like ash in his mouth and water turned bitter on his tongue. The people who once gathered at his side withdrew, leaving him isolated in his shame. Some whispered that he had been cursed, others that the ancestors themselves had judged him unworthy to walk as a husband or leader. His prideful steps faltered, his shoulders hunched, and the man who once strutted like a rooster now moved like a hunted animal, forever glancing over his shoulder at shadows that followed him everywhere. In his desperation, he sought cleansing rituals, offering sacrifices to the spirits in hopes of mercy. But no matter how much he gave, the rituals failed. The priests shook their heads, saying the ancestors could not be bribed, for the weight of a wounded heart was heavier than any offering of livestock or grain. The betrayal of loyalty, they said, is a sin that no wealth can cover. And so he was left to bear the punishment that came not from mortal hands, but from the unseen realm that governed balance and truth. His nights became endless storms of fear, and his days a slow march toward despair. He had betrayed a woman whose devotion had been her power, and that devotion had awakened forces greater than him. In time, the whispers grew louder, the shadows bolder, until he no longer knew whether the punishment came from outside or within. Perhaps it was the spirits, or perhaps it was his own soul unraveling beneath the weight of what he had done. The villagers avoided him, but they never forgot to teach their children his story. "This is what becomes of a man who betrays love and mocks devotion," they would say. And while the first wife's name was remembered with reverence, his was remembered with warning, a mark of shame carved into the history of the village. He lived, but his life was no longer truly his. It was owned by the spirits, haunted by the echoes of a cry that had spoken truth louder than his pride ever could. And in the end, that was his fate. Not just punishment, but remembrance as a man stripped of honor, condemned to live in the shadow of the wife he had wronged, forever a warning to others who dared to betray.